Northern France. Late summer, 1941. The morning sky is a pale blue canvas brushed with streaks of cirrus, calm, almost serene. But beneath that quiet lies tension. 12 Supermarine Spitfires, their Merlin engines humming in tight formation, guard a slow line of Blenheim bombers returning from a strike over Lille. At 20,000 feet, sunlight glints off their wings, a fragile shield over enemy territory. Then, without warning, the radio crackles. Bandits. 11 o'clock high. The first bursts of cannon fire slice through the formation. Messerschmitt Bf 109s dive from the sun, fast, sleek, predatory. The RAF escort scatters, the sky erupting into spirals of smoke, tracer lines, and screaming engines. One pilot, Flight Lieutenant of the second element, finds himself pinned. A 109 locks on, cannon shells walking toward his tail. He has seconds. No altitude, no allies in sight. Then, in a move that defies both training and physics, he rolls his Spitfire inverted and dives, upside down, straight toward the clouds below. The pursuing Germans hesitate. It's madness or genius. As the formation breaks apart, his squadron's survival hangs on that single, impossible decision. By mid-1941, the air war over Western Europe had entered a brutal and uncertain phase. The Battle of Britain was over, but victory had not brought safety. The Luftwaffe still ruled the skies over occupied Europe, and the Royal Air Force, now confident yet cautious, was pushing across the Channel into enemy territory. The new phase was called the Circus Offensive. Small bomber formations, Blenheims, Bostons, sometimes even Wellingtons, crossed the French coast by day, striking rail yards, airfields, and supply depots. Their true purpose, however, was not destruction. It was provocation. The bombers were bait. Their attacks were meant to lure the Luftwaffe's fighters into combat, to bleed German air strength and gain experience for the RAF's young pilots. But every circus came at a price. Operating deep over France meant flying far beyond the safety of radar coverage or friendly airfields. British pilots had minutes of fuel to fight, then had to sprint back across the Channel, often pursued the whole way. For the men of RAF Fighter Command, this was no longer a defensive struggle for home. It was a fight in hostile skies, where every mistake meant capture or death. The Germans had adapted quickly. After the setbacks of 1940, the Luftwaffe reorganized its fighter defenses in the west. Jagdgeschwader 2 Richthofen and Jagdgeschwader 26 Schlageter, both elite units, now patrolled northern France with the latest version of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Friedrich or Bf 109F. It was a different animal entirely. Streamlined, with a new engine and better aerodynamics, it could outclimb and outdive most Spitfires at high altitude. Its 20mm cannon could tear apart a bomber or fighter with a single burst. In the hands of veterans like Adolf Gorland and Joachim Muncheberg, the Friedrich was a weapon of surgical precision. For the RAF, this meant a cruel reversal of fortunes. During the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire had been the defender's blade, agile, quick, and able to fight over friendly territory. Now, the same aircraft had to fight offensively, climbing into the sun and engaging an enemy who always held the upper hand in altitude and positioning. Many of the men flying these missions were barely out of training. The average age of a pilot in 1941 was 21. They were brave, well-trained, but often flying against aces who had survived years of combat. The psychological strain was immense. Every sortie across the Channel carried the same unspoken thought: if I'm shot down, no one will come for me. RAF records described the growing pattern of losses, formations breaking apart under pressure, isolated pairs cut down by waiting Messerschmitts. The RAF called it the 109 trap. German controllers, watching from radar stations near Calais, could time their intercepts perfectly. The British began adapting, introducing new escort formations and tighter discipline in radio control. But the problem wasn't tactics alone. It was physics. A Spitfire Mkv, the mainstay of the RAF in 1941, could climb fast and turn tight, but in a sustained dive the Messerschmitt was faster. Its airframe could handle higher speeds before losing control. That meant that once a 109 had the advantage of height, the Spitfire below was in grave danger. The pilots knew it. They learned to fight by instinct, to sense energy and momentum, to feel the sky. They knew the breaking point of their wings, the pull of G-forces at the edge of blackout. This was not chess at 30,000 feet. It was hand-to-hand combat at 400 miles per hour. By the late summer of 1941, the RAF's offensive over France reached a deadly rhythm. Daily raids, constant loss, and hard lessons learned. Each mission brought new tactics, new improvisations, and occasional flashes of brilliance born from desperation. Among the squadrons flying these operations were some of Fighter Command's most battle-tested units, 64, 611, and 303 squadrons among them, rotating between bases in southern England and forward strips near the coast. They flew from dawn until dusk, often twice a day, often outnumbered. And on one of those routine sorties, a simple escort over Lille that should have been uneventful, a single pilot's desperate, inverted dive would change everything. These stories aren't just history, they're proof of human courage and sacrifice. If you too salute these heroes, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and become a part of our journey. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Let's continue the story. RAF Hornchurch, Essex, July 1941. The grass airfield trembles as the Spitfires of No. 611 Squadron line up for another Circus operation. The mission sheet is brief, almost routine. Escort 6 Blenheim bombers to Lille, bomb the rail yards, return by noon. But the men in the dispersal hut know what that really means. A 1-hour flight into enemy territory, a 10-minute window of chaos, and a lifetime's risk in between. Flight Lieutenant John Boulton, 25 years old, quiet, composed, walks toward his aircraft, a Spitfire Mkvb coded FYQ. He's led his flight before, though every takeoff still carries that same knot in the stomach. The ground crew strap him in, the canopy locks, the world becomes a closed glass sphere of noise and vibration. They climb through the morning haze, sunlight spilling across the channel. Below them, the sea glitters like metal shards. Ahead, the French coast rises, green and grey, broken by the scars of war, gun emplacements, smoke columns, bombed-out towns. Over the radio, the bomber leader's voice is calm. Target, Lille Marshalling Yard. Maintain altitude. Escorts take covering positions. Boulton glances left and right. 11 Spitfires hold steady, climbing slightly above and behind the bombers. To his right, Flying Officer Carter checks his gauges, oxygen, fuel, ammo. Each man focuses on his instruments, but everyone knows the real danger isn't mechanical. It's invisible, waiting, somewhere above the glare. The Luftwaffe's radar near St. Omer has already picked them up. Within minutes, a staffel of JG-26 lifts off from Marquis Airfield, 12 Bf 109 FS under the command of Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Schnell. Their job, intercept the British bombers before they reach the coast. Schnell's men climb fast, riding the thermals, their DB-601 engines screaming at full throttle. The German formation arcs east of the British path, using altitude and sun advantage, a tactic honed from hundreds of engagements. By the time 611 Squadron approaches Lille, the trap is set. From his cockpit, Boulton sees the bombers beginning their run, small black dots against the distant sprawl of factories and chimneys. The Spitfires spread slightly, covering the vulnerable formation. For a brief moment, all seems quiet. Then, a flicker. Tiny flashes above the sun's glare, at 11 o'clock high. Instinct kicks in before thought. Tally-ho! Bandits! The formation splits instantly. The German attack comes down like a hammer. Cannon fire, white smoke, tracers slicing through the air. One Blenheim erupts in flame, another veers off trailing smoke. The radio fills with clipped shouts, "Brake! Brake left!" Boulton pulls hard on the stick, feeling the Spitfire strain under G-forces. His head is pressed into the seat, his vision tunneling as black edges creep inward. When he recovers, the sky is chaos, Spitfires spiraling, 109s darting through them like hawks through pigeons. He dives to cover a bomber under attack, firing short bursts at a passing Messerschmitt. The German rolls away, climbing vertically, too fast to follow. Boulton curses under his breath. Above him, 3 109s are circling, coordinated, disciplined, hunting in pairs. The RAF formation has lost cohesion. Radio calls overlap, drowned by static. At 20,000 feet, oxygen is thin, and thought becomes mechanical. Years of training compress into seconds of instinct. Boulton glances at his rearview mirror. A black shape fills it. Cannon shells rip through the fuselage, smoke trailing from his tail. He's been caught. He pushes the throttle forward, full power. The Spitfire shudders, its Merlin engine roaring. But the German stays with him, matching every turn, every climb. Boulton knows the numbers. The Bf 109F can outdive him, but not if he can make the enemy overshoot. He banks sharply, trying to reverse the chase, but the 109 holds steady, closer with each burst. No time, no altitude, no help. And then, below, a break in the cloud layer. A silver-white sheet stretching across northern France. He makes the choice that no manual, no tactics lecture, no instructor would ever approve. He rolls the Spitfire inverted and pushes the stick forward. The aircraft tips upside down. Sky becomes ground, ground becomes sky, and he dives, head hanging beneath the harness, blood rushing to his temples. It's not a roll. It's not a dive. It's something in between, a controlled fall that defies logic. The pursuing German hesitates. No one dives inverted at this altitude. Not willingly. And in that heartbeat of confusion, the story that will define 611 Squadron begins. In the world of air combat, seconds decide survival. And in those seconds, tactics and machinery merge into instinct. To understand why that one upside-down dive saved an entire squadron, we need to step into the invisible geometry of aerial warfare in 1941. Tactical angle, the sky's invisible battlefield. Dogfights were not random swirls of chaos, they were three-dimensional chess. The pilots who survived longest understood altitude as currency, speed as credit, and energy as life. When Boulton's formation crossed into northern France, the Luftwaffe held every tactical advantage. German ground controllers positioned their fighters above the target area, using radar plots and relay towers to calculate exact intercept points. The Messerschmitts descended from higher altitude, out of the sun, the perfect bounce. 4 RAF escorts, that first bounce was often fatal. The Spitfires were forced defensive instantly, bleeding speed and altitude in evasive turns. Once that happened, the fight became a downhill chase, gravity and energy working for the attacker, not the defender. The only way to break that trap was unpredictability. A sudden maneuver that violated every expectation could shatter the geometry of the fight, confuse the pursuer for a heartbeat, just long enough to reset the engagement. That was exactly what Boulton's inverted dive achieved. By rolling his Spitfire onto its back and diving inverted through cloud, he disrupted the Germans' line of sight. The attacking pilot, expecting a conventional spiral or dive away, hesitated, unsure whether his target was in control or simply falling out of the sky. In aerial combat, hesitation was death. More importantly, That inverted roll forced the enemy to make a decision: follow the British fighter into the unknown, or pull up and regain altitude. Most chose the latter. It only took one to break pursuit for the rest of the formation to scatter and regroup. What looked like recklessness from the ground was, tactically, the purest form of improvisation, seizing chaos and turning it into space to breathe. Technological angle: two machines, two philosophies. The success of that dive was not luck alone. It rested on the hidden strengths and weaknesses of the two aircraft locked in combat. The Spitfire MKVB was a masterpiece of British engineering, designed for agility and control. Its elliptical wings gave it stability in tight turns, while the Rolls-Royce Merlin 45 engine offered power at medium altitudes. But that same airframe had limits. Beyond 450 miles per hour, control surfaces stiffened. A conventional dive at full speed risked structural failure or loss of control. The Messerschmitt Bf 109F, meanwhile, was faster in the dive. Its narrower wings and higher wing loading allowed it to slice through the air like a blade. In a straight pursuit, the German would have caught the Spitfire within seconds. Yet physics works both ways. When Boulton rolled inverted and pushed forward into the dive, he reversed the airflow over his wings, reducing lift but also reducing drag. The Spitfire, briefly, became a falling spear. It accelerated faster than the Messerschmitt, whose pilot now had to roll inverted himself, adjust trim, and maintain negative G control, a difficult task in the 109's cockpit. Here lay another subtle advantage: fuel system design. Early Bf 109s used a carburetor that struggled under negative G forces. During an inverted dive, fuel flow could falter, momentarily starving the engine. The Spitfire suffered the same issue until 1941, when a British engineer, Beatrice Tilly Schilling, introduced a simple brass restrictor, the Schilling orifice, to prevent fuel surge. That tiny modification meant that, for a few crucial seconds, the Spitfire could maintain full power under negative G while the Messerschmitt risked engine sputter. In those same seconds, Boulton vanished into the clouds. The technology of two nations, their engineering choices, their philosophies of combat, collided in one instant of survival. The inverted dive was more than an act of desperation. It was a moment where design met instinct. Every control input, every vibration through the stick, told the pilot what his aircraft could endure. He was not defying physics, he was riding its edge. The Germans called such escapes Glücksmanöver, luck maneuvers. The RAF called them something else entirely: experience. In later reports, squadron mates recalled that Boulton's dive opened a hole in the sky. It gave scattered pilots a visual cue, a line to follow into cover. Within seconds, 3 more Spitfires plunged into the cloud layer, breaking radar lock and sight contact. By the time the Messerschmitts regrouped above, their prey had vanished. That single tactical anomaly saved the squadron from annihilation. And as every fighter pilot knew, once inside cloud, survival became a different battle altogether. One fought not against the enemy, but against disorientation, vertigo, and the black void of uncertainty. The Spitfire had survived the 109's initial strike. But the story of how the pilot and his men made it back across the channel, alive, scattered, and shaken, would reveal the deeper human dimension of aerial combat. Human angle, the fear and instinct of the sky. Inside the cockpit of a Spitfire at 20,000 feet, there was no space for fear, only sensation. The smell of heated oil. The vibration of the Merlin engine. The scream of wind pressing against perspex. But fear existed all the same, quiet and coiled behind every reflex. For Flight Lieutenant John Boulton, the moment of inversion was not planned. It wasn't part of doctrine, nor born of calm calculation. It was the subconscious reaction of a man who had seen death closing fast and chose motion over paralysis. A pilot in that era didn't think in words. His mind processed only shapes, energy, light. The flicker of tracer fire, the shadow on the wing, the changing tone of the engine. Inverted flight at combat speed meant his world turned liquid, the horizon vanished, and his body screamed with disorientation. Blood rushed to his head, and vision narrowed to red haze. Yet, within that chaos, something primal took over, the trust in machine and muscle memory. The inverted dive demanded complete surrender to the aircraft. The stick forward, rudder correction, trim adjustment, all performed without conscious thought. Every pilot trained for this moment, but few experienced it and lived. The Spitfire groaned under the strain. Airspeed surged. Control stiffened. One wrong move, one fraction too much forward pressure, and the wings could shear. But Boulton held it, feeling every ounce of tension in the frame. The dive wasn't blind courage. It was a desperate harmony between man and machine, the kind of connection only those who flew alone could ever understand. Down through the white mist he plunged, gravity roaring around him. Above, the pursuing 109 hesitated, perhaps believing the British pilot had blacked out, perhaps fearing the dive's end would be the ground itself. When Boulton broke through the lower cloud deck, the world was silent again. No enemy in sight. No formation, no wingman, just empty sky and his heart pounding in his chest. Every pilot in fighter command lived with the same contradiction. They fought as a team but died alone. Radio chatter could never mask the solitude of combat. Once the fight began, the sky fragmented into isolated duels. Boulton's men, scattered by the initial attack, made their own split-second choices. Two followed his dive, purely on instinct. They didn't know his plan. They simply saw their leader vanish downward and reacted. For those pilots, following was faith. They trusted their leader's intuition, even if it seemed suicidal. And that trust, invisible but unbreakable, was what bound squadrons together. In combat, leadership wasn't about orders. It was about example. The way a flight commander moved, reacted, or fought told every man what to do without a single word spoken. Leadership angle, the burden of command. In aerial warfare, leadership had no time for ceremony. A squadron commander might be only 24 years old, but he carried the weight of 10 lives every time he took off. He had to decide formation spacing, altitude, approach angle, and disengagement point, and then, in the chaos of combat, improvise all of it in seconds. Boulton's decision to dive inverted wasn't just about his own escape. Unintentionally, it became an act of leadership through instinct. His maneuver drew enemy attention, created confusion, and gave his section the gap they needed to dive away. Later debriefs from surviving pilots described seeing the boss roll over and disappear, followed by a chain reaction, 3 Spitfires breaking into cloud and vanishing before the 109s could react. Those moments, chaotic and wordless, often defined survival rates more than planning ever could. Leadership in the air was not command. It was courage amplified. For Boulton, that courage came at a cost. Pilots rarely spoke of fear or guilt, but they felt both deeply. Each lost wingman, each empty bunk after sortie, added weight. They carried the ghosts of those they couldn't save. Back at base, after the Lille operation, witnesses recalled him walking silently from his aircraft, still trembling from adrenaline. His crew chief asked, "Rough one, sir?" Boulton only nodded, saying quietly, "They followed me through." It wasn't triumph. It was disbelief, and relief edged with sorrow. Because for every squadron that came back intact, another didn't. The human and leadership dimensions of that single dive reveal more than just an aerial tactic. They expose the fragile balance that defined the men who fought the air war, intelligence measured in split seconds, leadership proven not by words but by instinct. To understand what followed, the chaos within the clouds, and the desperate struggle to regroup, We must step into the moment where the dive reached its lowest point. Below the mist, where visibility was near zero and the altimeter needle spun downward, the inverted escape became not just an act of skill, but a fight against gravity itself. The altimeter spun past 15,000 feet. Then 12. Outside the cockpit canopy, the world dissolved into blinding white. Cloud swallowed everything: horizon, sun, even the sound of gunfire. Inside, Flight Lieutenant John Boulton hung inverted in his harness, gravity pressing against his shoulders, blood flooding his eyes. The Spitfire howled as the dive steepened. He could barely see his instruments. Condensation streaked across the glass. The artificial horizon was useless. Only the altimeter and airspeed indicator still made sense, both rising fast. 420 miles per hour. 440, 460. The edge of structural failure. His hands trembled on the stick. He eased pressure forward, keeping the dive shallow enough to avoid tearing the wings off, yet steep enough to stay unpredictable. The Merlin engine roared steadily, a sound that told him the aircraft, though screaming, was still alive. The sensation was surreal, as if falling through eternity. The cockpit vibrated, metal creaked, every rivet groaning. The white fog outside pulsed and flickered with light, tracer fire somewhere above, fading fast. Then, just for a second, silence. He was alone. The hunter had vanished. Above the clouds, the Bf 109 pilot, Oberleutnant Schnell, had followed as far as he dared. His altimeter ticked downward, 15,000 feet. 10,000, then 8,000. The German's vision blurred as negative G pressed into his chest. His Daimler-Benz engine coughed once. The carburetor starved for fuel. He cursed, pulled the stick, and rolled upright. The Messerschmitt's nose pitched up, engine catching again as he climbed away. Below him, the British fighter had disappeared into the cloud deck, leaving no trace. For a brief moment, Schnell hovered at the boundary, torn between pursuit and prudence. Chasing blind into cloud meant suicide. The Luftwaffe's doctrine forbade it. So he leveled off, radioing his wingman to reform. To him, the enemy was gone, a kill denied by nature itself. Below, Boulton's Spitfire tore through the lower layers of cloud. Visibility returned in patches, first grey, then pale blue, then the mottled green of the French countryside below. He rolled upright, heart pounding, breath shallow. The altimeter steadied at 4,000 feet. He had lost nearly 16,000 feet in less than a minute. The radio was static. Every channel filled with faint, broken voices, call signs, curses, the occasional scream of interference. He scanned the sky. No Messerschmitts. No Blenheims. No Spitfires. Only emptiness. Then, a flash to his right. A silver wing glinting through haze. Another Spitfire. Then a second, lower and to the left. Both trailing smoke but flying level. They'd followed him through. He keyed the transmitter. Blue section. Form up if you can. Keep low. No response. But the two aircraft slid closer, wingtip steady, formation reforming instinctively. At treetop level, the world slowed. The roar of the engines softened into a steady hum. The landscape stretched endlessly, rivers, hedgerows, the patchwork of fields. He turned west, toward the faint shimmer that meant the English Channel. The danger wasn't over. The Luftwaffe's flak belts covered every approach route. Any aircraft below 5,000 feet risked anti-aircraft fire. But Boulton knew the odds above were worse. Staying low meant invisibility. He trimmed the Spitfire and focused on his compass heading, 290 degrees. West-northwest. The way home. For the next 10 minutes, they flew in near silence. Occasionally a radio crackle, a distorted voice. Once, the distant bark of flak guns to the north. Then, sudden movement. A 109 diving from cloud at their 4 o'clock, cannons flashing. Boulton snapped into a roll, pulling up sharply. The German overshot, diving past. The Spitfire's guns barked, 4.303 Brownings and two 20mm Hispano cannons. Tracers reached out, crossing the 109's path. A flash. A puff of black smoke. The Messerschmitt shuddered and banked away, trailing fire. It was over in seconds, a brutal exchange, instinctive, wordless. Boulton steadied again, eyes searching. The other two Spitfires were still there. Shaken, but alive. By the time they reached the Channel coast, fuel gauges hovered near empty. The sea glimmered below like dark glass. Behind them, France shrank into haze. Crossing that strip of water felt like resurrection. The radio finally cleared, Hornchurch control, faint but real. Blue section, identify. Do you copy? Boulton keyed the MIC, voice hoarse. Blue leader returning. 3 aircraft. Mission complete. Static. Then. Copy that, blue leader. You're clear to land. The inverted dive had saved them, though in the moment it had been nothing more than an act of instinct. The rest of the squadron, scattered or destroyed, would limp home in fragments. Some would never return. When Boulton's Spitfire touched down, its tires screeching against the grass runway, ground crews ran toward him. The aircraft was riddled with holes, the tail shredded. Yet it had flown the whole way home. He shut down the engine, opened the canopy, and sat motionless. For a few seconds, he couldn't move. The roar in his ears wasn't the engine anymore. It was his own pulse. On the far side of the field, another Spitfire landed, skidding into the grass. Then another. 3 aircraft. Out of 12. And all 3 had survived because one pilot had turned the world upside down. But that was only the first half of the story. What happened after the landing, the debriefs, the German records, and the tactical ripple that followed would define how the RAF learned from that day. Hornchurch Airfield, late afternoon. The sun was low, the wind carrying the smell of hot metal and cut grass. Ground crews stood silently as the damaged Spitfires rolled to a stop, engines ticking, wings punctured, paint scorched by exhaust. 3 aircraft. Out of 12. The base controller watched from the tower, lips tight, headset pressed to one ear. His notes were already grim. 5 confirmed missing, 4 unaccounted for. Only 1 bomber had returned. The rest were somewhere over France, burning, broken, or captured. Flight Lieutenant Boulton climbed out of his cockpit slowly, unsteady on his feet. His flying suit was soaked in sweat, his face streaked with oil. A mechanic reached out to help him down, but he waved him off, still half in shock. The other 2 surviving pilots, Carter and Hammond, joined him minutes later. Neither spoke. They simply looked at one another, sharing the unspoken understanding that only those who had been there could comprehend. In the debriefing hut, the atmosphere was heavy. Intelligence officers sat with clipboards, asking the usual questions: altitude of contact, number of enemy aircraft, time of engagement. But the accounts didn't match. Every man had seen something different: the sun, the flashes, the smoke, the chaos. No one could remember the exact order of events. Then came the detail that silenced the room. Carter leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly. He rolled her over, he said. Completely inverted. Right before the cloud. I thought he'd lost control. The intelligence officer frowned. You mean a split S? Carter shook his head. No. Not a split S. He stayed inverted the whole way down. Through the cloud. The officer scribbled a note, looked up. And the result. Carter exhaled. We all lived. The room went quiet. In the following days, squadron records would mark the event simply as enemy engagement over Lille, heavy losses sustained, 3 aircraft returned. No mention of the maneuver, no technical breakdown. Officially, it was just another costly operation. Unofficially, the story spread like wildfire. Pilots in other squadrons began whispering about the upside-down dive, a trick that could break pursuit when everything else failed. Some dismissed it as luck. Others practiced it over the channel, experimenting with controlled negative-G dives through cloud layers. Instructors at the operational training units would later discuss it under a different name, the negative escape roll. A dangerous but sometimes life-saving maneuver used to force overshoot or confuse pursuit. It was never codified in manuals. Too risky, too dependent on instinct. But those who knew, knew. For Boulton, the aftermath was not glory but exhaustion. In his logbook, the entry for that day was brief. Circus 64, Lille Rail Yard. Heavy enemy contact. Aircraft damaged. Returned with 2 others. Visibility poor. No mention of the dive, the chaos, or the men who didn't return. He spent the evening in silence, sitting by the edge of the airfield as the light faded, the sound of distant Merlins echoing in the hangars. His crew chief, Sergeant Webb, approached quietly, carrying a mug of tea. "Bloody close one, sir," he muttered. Boulton nodded. Too close. He looked toward the horizon, the same horizon he'd fallen through hours earlier. Somewhere beyond it, over France, his friends lay scattered. That night, intelligence officers cross-referenced Luftwaffe reports from the same area. The Germans recorded 3 British fighters seen entering cloud layer, presumed destroyed. To them, the inverted dive had looked like suicide. None had realized that those same aircraft would reappear over England an hour later. It was the kind of moment that revealed the limits of doctrine, where courage and chaos intertwined. The following week, 611 Squadron was re-equipped with new Spitfires and rotated to rest at Digby. Boulton was recommended for a Distinguished Flying Cross, though the citation never mentioned the dive. It read simply, "For exceptional leadership and presence of mind in action against enemy aircraft over hostile territory." He accepted it quietly, almost reluctantly. To him, medals meant little. Survival was the only reward that mattered. But to those who heard the story, to the young pilots who sat in dispersal huts, waiting for the next scramble order, it meant everything. They knew that courage didn't always look like attacking. Sometimes it looked like surrendering to gravity, trusting the machine, and diving headfirst into the unknown. That one moment, a flash of instinct in a collapsing sky, became legend. When the next Circus operations began, new tactics emerged. Spitfire formations began using rapid vertical brakes and dives through cloud cover to disengage from higher 109s. They didn't call it Boulton's maneuver. They didn't need to. The technique spoke for itself. Above all, it reflected what the air war had become by 1941, not a contest of numbers, but of nerve. Each mission pushed men to the threshold where training ended and instinct took over. The sky, once their battlefield, had become a crucible of human limits. And for one brief moment, on a summer morning over Lille, that limit had been turned upside down. The guns fell silent, but their echoes reached far, through tactics, through doctrine, through the very psychology of air combat. To understand what that moment changed, we must now look at its long shadow, in the reports, the tactics, and the way men remembered the cost. By the end of that week, Fighter Command's Operations Board at Bentley Priory had already filed the Lille raid under partial success. The numbers told a familiar story: 6 Blenheims lost, 4 Spitfires confirmed missing, 2 damaged beyond repair. It was one more line in the growing ledger of losses that defined the air war of 1941. Yet buried in the accompanying reports was something that caught the attention of analysts at RAF headquarters: a reference to a low-altitude disengagement maneuver, inverted descent through cloud. The phrasing was vague, almost accidental. But in the meticulous world of intelligence summaries, even vague things were noted. At Tangmere, where the surviving pilots were briefly rotated for rest, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park reviewed the debrief notes himself. Park, a veteran of the Battle of Britain, understood the razor edge between courage and folly. He'd seen too many new pilots die because they clung to conventional tactics or hesitated to break them. Here, at last, was something different: initiative under fire. A pilot who had acted on instinct, not orders, and saved others because of it. He didn't know the name yet. The report simply listed Fl Boulton, but the maneuver described would echo through every tactics discussion of the coming months. Across the Channel, in occupied France, the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader 26, Schlaggeter, filed its own after-action reports. Oberleutnant Karl Boris, flying that day under the command of Adolf Gorland, noted an unusual disappearance of British fighters into low cloud, inverted. His wingmen had nearly followed, only to pull out at the last moment, fearing structural failure. They had assumed the enemy destroyed. No wrecks were ever found. Galland's post-mission commentary, preserved in German archives, described it curtly: the Englishman's courage borders on insanity. Yet, sometimes, insanity wins. It was a grudging respect from one of Germany's finest aces, and a rare acknowledgement that the RAF's resilience came not only from strategy, but from unpredictable acts of human defiance. In Britain, instructors at operational training units quietly circulated word of the negative roll dive. They cautioned against deliberate use, dangerous beyond reason, one manual noted, but also admitted its potential as a last-ditch defense against pursuit. The Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford even ran tests using captured Bf 109E aircraft to simulate high-speed dives under negative G conditions. The findings were striking. While the 109 could outperform most Spitfires in climb and acceleration, its Daimler-Benz engine fuel system struggled briefly during sustained inverted flight. A second or two of fuel starvation could cause the engine to cough or flame out. That discovery explained everything. Boulton's inverted dive hadn't been pure luck. It had exploited a hidden weakness in the enemy machine. For the first time, the RAF understood that inverting and diving wasn't just an escape. It could trigger a temporary mechanical failure in the pursuer. In squadron ready rooms, pilots began to discuss it quietly, almost superstitiously. "Turn her over," one would whisper. "Let Jerry choke on his own fuel pump." They laughed, but the lesson was serious. Technology, psychology, and survival had merged in that moment, and the sky was now an arena where every split-second decision could rewrite the rules of engagement. Back at Digby, Boulton himself never mentioned it again. He flew more missions, led more men, and buried more friends. But those who served with him remembered that calm, deliberate role, the kind that only a man who had already accepted death could pull off. In his logbook, a year later, a single note appeared beside a sortie entry: "Cloud cover, inverted brake effective." That was all. No bravado. No explanation. Just a reminder that survival was often hidden in simplicity. The maneuver's legacy would ripple outward, influencing tactics, training, and even design philosophy. But the most profound change was invisible, a shift in how pilots viewed the thin line between discipline and improvisation. Rules saved lives. Instincts saved more. And somewhere between those two truths, the RAF learned how to survive an enemy that seemed unstoppable. By early autumn 1941, the RAF's daylight operations were changing shape. Circus missions, designed to draw the Luftwaffe into battle, had bled squadrons dry for months. Morale wavered. Losses mounted. But amid that fatigue, quiet adaptations were taking place, small, tactical evolutions born from the desperate improvisations of men like Boulton. One of those changes was subtle but far-reaching, the growing understanding that the vertical plane, not just the horizontal, was the true battlefield. Up until then, much of RAF fighter training emphasized turning engagements, outmaneuvering the enemy in tight circles, using teamwork and positioning. But the Germans had forced the issue upward and downward. The 109s dove from above, struck fast, and climbed away, using altitude like a weapon. Now, the RAF began to meet them on their own terms. Reports from Fighter Command's Tactics Review in November 1941 mentioned the first formal recommendation for high-speed disengagement through cloud, explicitly describing it as a controlled descent, sometimes inverted, to confuse pursuit. The term inverted appeared for the first time in an official British Air Ministry memo. It didn't name Boulton or 611 Squadron, but the phrasing was unmistakable. That same month, Spitfire units across No. 11 Group began incorporating vertical escape drills into practice sorties. Pilots were taught to exploit differences in engine behavior, to use cloud banks tactically, and, most importantly, to trust their instincts when standard procedures failed. The lesson was clear. Survival favored those willing to defy the textbook. The Luftwaffe noticed the change almost immediately. German combat reports from Jagdgeschwader 26 and 2, the main defenders of northern France, began noting increased evasive diving behavior among British formations. At first, German aces mocked it. They believed it was panic, that British pilots were simply running away. But soon, they realized those panic dives often ended with their own fuel lines sputtering mid-pursuit, or with their formations broken in cloud. It wasn't cowardice. It was calculation. Adolf Gorland himself, ever the tactician, ordered tests on sustained inverted flight to understand what was happening. The findings frustrated him. The Bf 109's carbureted Daimler-Benz engine, despite its technical superiority in other areas, was still vulnerable to momentary fuel starvation when fully inverted, a quirk the British, using float carburetors, had ironically learned to exploit in reverse. It was one of those rare moments when design philosophy itself became a weapon. By 1942, the arrival of the Spitfire Mk9, with its improved Merlin 61 engine and higher altitude performance, made such vertical tactics even more viable. What had once been a desperate dive for survival now became a deliberate maneuver, a tactical inversion. Instructors began to frame it in broader terms. The pilot who controlled gravity controlled the fight. It was a quiet revolution, one born not in laboratories or command rooms, but in a moment of instinct, fear, and clarity above the clouds. Even years later, those who had flown in 1941 would recall that shift. In post-war interviews, RAF ace Johnny Johnson reflected, "We stopped fighting the Germans on their terms when we learned to use the sky like a third dimension. Every layer of cloud was a weapon if you knew how to use it." And while he never mentioned Boulton by name, the seeds of that realization had been planted by him and others like him, pilots who trusted their machines and their own nerve when doctrine had nothing left to offer. By 1943, when the air war turned back to war defense, with Spitfires sweeping over France ahead of the invasion, the RAF's understanding of energy fighting, dive recovery, and vertical escape was decades ahead of where it had been in 1940. Historians would later trace that evolution to several key inflection points. Among them, they'd find the quiet footnote from 611 Squadron's report on the Lille raid. Engaged by numerically superior enemy. Pilot inverted and dove through cloud. Enemy pursuit broken. A single line, almost lost in paperwork. Yet from it, the RAF had learned how to survive and how to think differently about the very nature of flight. The aftermath of one pilot's decision had stretched across the entire air war. And in doing so, it had revealed something deeper, that progress in combat isn't always born from command or design. Sometimes, it's born from the chaos of a single heartbeat in a dying sky. Every war leaves behind its heroes, its machines, and its myths. But in the story of air combat, it is often the moments that never made the records that define the truth. Flight Lieutenant Boulton's inverted dive was not celebrated, photographed, or even formally taught. It lived only in memory, in a few lines of ink, a few hushed retellings, and the quiet respect of those who knew what it meant to face death at 20,000 feet. It was not a victory in the traditional sense. No enemy was destroyed. No medals pinned for gallantry. Yet it embodied something far rarer, the raw intelligence of survival. In the Second World War, the sky was a shifting, invisible battlefield, one where equations of lift, drag, and thrust met the limits of human fear and courage. Each pilot carried not just a weapon, but a question: when the rules fail, what remains? For Boulton, the answer came not from training manuals or orders, but from instinct, the oldest and purest of all survival tools. His upside-down dive was less about defiance than surrender, surrendering to physics, to gravity, to the fleeting realization that sometimes survival means trusting the unknown. In that single moment, as his Spitfire fell inverted through the clouds, the great machinery of war, tactics, doctrine, design, faded away. What remained was one man, one machine, and the thin edge of instinct that separates life from death. It was there, in that empty sky between certainty and chaos, that the true nature of aerial warfare revealed itself, not as a contest of power, but as a dialogue between courage and the unknown. The war would go on. New engines would rise, new wings would cut through higher skies, and newer generations of pilots would learn from those who came before. But somewhere in the echo of every dive, every desperate maneuver through cloud and sun, there lingers the ghost of that moment, when one man turned his world upside down to save the lives of others. And for a brief instant, in the silence after the dive, the sky itself seemed to hold its breath.